I guess I should try and recruit as many people in the room by saying I often talk about from a perspective of aquatic ecosystems and fish and waterfowl and that type of thing. So by a show of hands, who has done fishing in their life? Or hunting for waterfowl, for that matter. And then I thought, well, some younger folks might not have had those experiences. Well, who's made like a duck face or a selfie or maybe a fish face with their kids? And that wouldn't be feasible without the aquatic ecosystem. But whose water are we selling is what I called our talk. And I think that really gets to the point. We are all downstream. We all share our water. Is it your water we're selling? Is it mine? Is it our neighbors? Is it a trout's? Is it a waterfowl's? And that's really where I seek to focus the talk and hopefully have some good discussion afterwards as well. Just by way of brief introduction, the Environmental Law Center is a nonprofit registered charity with a goal of seeing the environment and environmental laws and processes being protective of the environment. So you know where we're coming from. We do information or referral services if you want to talk to a lawyer for free, which is crazy, I know. But we can give you law and policy information, although we don't give legal advice per se. And then we also do a lot of law reform initiatives on different environmental law and policy in the province. So market concerns. I kind of section them out into environmental and social concerns. And as I'll go through in my talk, we'll talk about this whole issue of overallocation, some of the climate uncertainty that's been discussed recently, and then the impacts of the markets themselves and being able to track and tackle that is a key issue. On the social side, what are the impacts of moving markets from one user to another? We've been talking about that, and I'll briefly discuss some of the jurisdictions that have been in water markets for a longer period of time, and there has to be kind of warning signs there for our activities here. And then there's the issue of kind of the social equity issue of putting a greater value on these licensed volumes of water that licensees can then sell for an increased profit, even though they've been generating profit from the water use from the get-go. And it is a Crown use owned resource. And when we think of water, as has been discussed in the previous talks, certainly sturgeon-like water in that picture there in the North Saskatchewan River. The floods in Calgary and surrounding areas are a stark example that water management is harder than you think. And when we talk about agriculture and every other land use, really we're talking about water in upland habitats, riparian habitats, in the river themselves, and that supports a variety of ecosystem services that we use and just the ecosystem itself and its own value. As has been discussed, the South Saskatchewan River Basin has been overallocated. So this is a chart from Alberta Environment, or Alberta Environment and Sustainable Resource Development now, but at the time it was Alberta Environment. And the blue line can show you how much was allocated through the licenses, and you could see the volumes of the river in the black there, and you can see the blue line exceeding the black line there. So there's been various studies about what are the actual impacts of this overallocation. Past studies that have occurred have said that the aquatic ecosystems are being degraded, particularly just downstream of major diversions. So that's an ongoing concern, particularly in the South Saskatchewan River Basin. And we can also add that another basin just recently got approved water management transfers through a water management plan in the Battle River Basin, and that just occurred like a week or two ago that it went through cabinet. There's also climate uncertainty. We have snowpack issues, variability in snowpack. We have the glaciers that Humphrey mentioned receding, and that contribution to our in-stream flows is going to be diminished. And then we have seasonal variability. A lot of people, as you may know, have been talking about how climate change is often resulting in increased impacts or more intense storms and more intense water precipitation events. And certainly in some discussions I've seen that the city of Edmonton has been involved in, that's certainly a key concern for a lot of people who manage urban infrastructure. As they say, now we're getting 5 rain events that were used to be 1 in 100-year events, now there's like 5 in one season, and they're really finding the infrastructure is unsuitable for dealing with it. They've done some modeling around future impacts on the South Saskatchewan River Basin. This was recently done 2013, 2014. And again, the capacity for rivers to act as a pollution control or pollution dilution agent. So water quality issues are likely to be increased in times of drought. And aquatic environments are going to be, again, put in under pressure in those times. And in-stream objectives are really going to be under threat. The water conservation objectives, which are set through the water management plan, are often not going to be met in future scenarios. So these are some graphs. The 3 colored tone graph up there indicates that there's a significant portion of weeks during the year where water conservation objectives won't be met in the 3 scenarios that they modeled in this instance. For the North Saskatchewan River, again, each color represents a different model that was run in terms of both temperature and precipitation. So depending on the model, sometimes we're seeing increased precipitation in the North Saskatchewan watershed or in the North Saskatchewan Basin, whereas other models we see significant decreases in some summer months in precipitation. So that should be a concern in terms of timing of water and issues around storage and allocation and diversion. So we have over-allocation, we have uncertainty related to the climate, and then we add on top of the market. And I just put out there that that's the question mark we have to deal with. And we have to deal with it with our eyes open and clear, and really have to delve into these discussions on a broader level than have occurred to date. There's the issue of water allocation versus the actual water use. The idea of these sleeper or dozer rights, so people with water licenses who may have not used much of their license or most of their license that then transfer some of that license to other users. And David mentioned an aspect of that, which I'll discuss. The whole idea about holdbacks, Dave mentioned that when you do a water transfer, you can hold back up to 10% at the discretion of the government, and I'll talk about that. And then the environmental flow restoration part. If in-stream flow objectives aren't being met, how can we get water back in those rivers? So this is a very simplified graph I've put together. It's dealing with a very complex issue about volumes, the rate of flows, environmental flows, and all these things. So it's just a snapshot in time for illustration purposes. I just want to make that clear. But really the idea is, historically we've had the water allocated, which is in the medium blue there, and the water used, which is in the darker blue. You add the market on that, you immediately have the risk of intensifying the use of the allocated water. The more you sell off licenses or unused licenses, there can be an intensification of use and therefore less water in the river. Add on that the issue with climate change and reduced flow, then that can just exacerbate the problems related to in-stream flow needs. So if you overlay that, and now this is going the opposite way with 100% of the flow at the bottom of the graph, you can have a water conservation objective in the South Saskatchewan River Basin of 45% of mean annual flow. And sometimes the risk of not meeting that is going to be increased as you intensify use and with climate change. And similarly, in-stream flow needs, which are often very much higher than what water conservation objectives are often not going to be met. And that has implications for our quality of life. It has implications for fishing. It has implications for the aquatic environment, certainly. On transfers and water holdbacks, there's a study or some review done in 2011 about holdbacks in the southern tributaries around Oldman and different basins there. And really, the holdback mechanism isn't going to be sufficient to get where we need to go on in-stream flow needs. So holdback flow rates that ended up going into WCO licenses that are held by the Crown ranged from 0.0004%, or sorry, meters, that shouldn't be a percent, that should be cubic meters per second, to 0.036. And then you compare that with some of the in-stream objectives in some of the southern tributaries of the Lower Belly River, Lower Waterton River. And it's almost orders of magnitude that you have to make up to generate significant gains for holdbacks. And then the broader issue from an environmental perspective is how do we actually have the environment participate in the market itself? If we're going to be selling off licenses, it makes sense to allow for the environmental holder or the license people who want to purchase licenses for environmental reasons to do so. Under current legislation, there's no mechanisms for private parties to buy in-stream licenses. And to date, the government of Alberta hasn't been overly eager to purchase it or restore flows through purchases in the market, which in different jurisdictions like Australia, where granted the issues are far more stark, they're dealing with droughts that probably make ours seem like child's play a little bit, but they committed over 3 billion Australian dollars to purchasing of environmental water some years ago, almost a decade ago now. And then there's social impacts, and this is reflected in some of the water markets in both the Western US and in Australia. There are concerns about transferring use from rural areas, so often irrigation or other farming uses, to industrial or urban uses. That has implications for rural communities because their rural economies may suffer if a lot of irrigators, for instance, exit their profession and sell off their water licenses. There can be that issue. Now in Alberta, the senior licenses for irrigation districts are more concrete insofar as it's not that easy for individual irrigators to just leave and sell off their license. But if you want a market to actually work, I would suggest that you actually have to have a mechanism to easily kind of split up those senior irrigation licenses so that individual farmers can sell those license amounts. And then there's the broader equity concern on the social side. If it is a public resource, if we consider it a public resource, we're all downstream, as you say, don't drink downstream of the cows. And so we allocate it for private gain, for diversion, for economic growth. So adding to the market, we're also adding that added benefit of allowing people who happen to be around earlier to sell those licenses for that additional gain of that value of the license now that the basin is closed. It's almost like somebody won the lottery. They went to the blackjack table or something and said, woohoo, I got a water license and now the basin's closed so I can sell it for some gain. So, and that includes possibly a portion that was never used. So that's an ongoing concern. And that's more of a ideological and philosophical discussion of how we treat water and how, if any way, we should change how we manage water. There are safeguards, as David alluded to. Impairment of other users is prohibited through the transfer process, but that doesn't necessarily get to the underlying impacts on economics, communities, and environmental issues that are at play. There is also protection of the environment in both the water management planning process and in the legislation, but it is highly discretionary, and there's a lot of question of whether it's being implemented in a proper fashion. Alternatives, as I mentioned, we can engage the market for in-stream gains, create mechanisms whereby people can invest in in-stream licenses, change the Water Act to allow for sharing. We see that senior license holders, when the droughts were in or the southern portion of the province in 2002, 2003, that sharing happened anyway. So why not put a mechanism in place to allow that sharing? There's also the question of reallocation where public investments are involved. So if the government is paying for money for conservation efforts, both whether it's in irrigation districts or otherwise, perhaps a higher level of holdback should occur in those instances. Or water fees for driving conservation. Talk about a contentious issue, start putting a dollar sign on the volume of water you're diverting, then you'll get people's attention. And then on the whole issue of demand management, and this goes to Humphrey's point of regional planning, we have to start thinking about how we manage, and it might not be overly palatable in many circles, but how we manage our demand for water. Are we just letting the market drive our resource consumption, notwithstanding the environmental impact? Or are we going to actually drive towards demand management, which requires us to kind of pick and choose winners and losers, depending on both their economic value, but also in terms of their water resource consumption? So putting that balance into play. And that sums it up, and I invite questions and discussion.